So just take a moment of silence to prepare ourselves for the set aside prayer. God, please help me set aside everything I think I know about myself, fantasy, anorexia, my sex and love addiction, the 12 steps, and especially you. So I may have an open mind and a new experience of all these things. Please let me see the truth. Your will, not mine, be done.
Hey everyone, I'm a sex, love, and fantasy addict and also production editor for this piece of literature. So if you'd all like to vote for it, please join the CLC where its fate is being decided. The characteristics of fantasy for sex and love addicts. One, we confuse fantasy with real life. We attach the need for love, healing, intimacy, and growth to people or scenarios about which we compulsively fantasize. Two, we experience emotional instability to the degree our fantasies conflict with reality. Three, we allow fantasies to become our higher power, using them to numb reality and avoid our pain, fear, and low self esteem. Four, precious time, interest, and fact, focus are lost to the distraction of our addictive fantasies. Five, our lives become unmanageable as we are immobilized by our fantasies, risking serious consequences. Six, our development and healthy aspirations are held hostage by our addictive fantasies. Seven, our daily conflict between our fantasies and the real world leaves us susceptible to continued acting out. Eight, as seen through our distorted lens, interactions with the objects of our fantasies become unrealistic as we fail to regard who or what they are and ignore their boundaries and needs. Nine, when reality intrudes upon our fantasies, we experience deep pain and debilitating disappointment. 10, when our fantasies don't come true, we feel anxiety, depression, and despair, depriving ourselves of joy and hope. 11, we become angry at those we fantasize about for having their own lives, which may not include us, leaving us alone and frustrated. And 12, we continue to live in our fantasies, denying their empty nature and avoiding deeper healing, growth, and connection with higher power and others.
So here's a speaker bio for today's speaker. So is a member of SLAA and has been sober since September 2025. They're a queer and transmasculine slash non-binary person living in rural North Carolina. In their recovery, fantasy addiction has shown up as a trauma response closely tied to social, emotional, and sexual anorexia. What once felt like imagination or insight was often a way of avoiding real vulnerability, filling in the unknown with certainty before reality could speak. Recovery has meant learning to live in reality, even when it feels less dramatic.
As was said, I belong here. Um, well, I'm going to go into my own history here somewhat. I'm going to keep this fairly zoomed out for the talk and leave the Q&A portion more open for questions about my personal experience. And I'll also give a brief content warning here that there will be very brief mentions of some triggering content, but I've left out the most graphic details. So with that said, I'd like to start today by grounding fantasy, or the idea of it, in something much more basic than addiction. Because fantasy is not a niche problem, it's not a personal flaw or a character defect. Fantasy is a fundamental part of being human. It's one of the ways the mind develops, one of the ways we learn, and one of the ways we survive. From a very early stage, long before we have language or a stable sense of self, the mind begins to fill in gaps. In that sense, fantasy is not optional. My early childhood was no different in that regard. One way it differed from many, however, was in having a deaf parent and a particularly resentful older sister. From the start, communication was unreliable and manipulated in ways that created an unsafe environment. As one example, often when the three of us were alone, my sister would pick fights with me to annoy my mom until she turned her hearing aids off. Once free of that supervision, she would then pretend to be possessed by a demon named Sam, who planned to murder me in my sleep. Sounds a little funnier in hindsight, but as a 3-year-old kid, it set some powerful precedents. It trained my very malleable mind to construct gruesome internal narratives, how that might be achieved, how I might prevent it, how I might stay alive. So when I talk about fantasy, I'm not talking about something that needs to be eliminated. It can't be. I'm talking about something that becomes difficult when its function changes and dangerous when it becomes maladaptive or addictive. Because in its original form, fantasy is meant to help us engage with reality more effectively, not avoid or replace it. Sometimes, though, that original form gets contorted into something that's no longer serving us. Usually, that's because something in our reality has become, for whatever reasons, too difficult to face head on. When the environment becomes unreliable, overwhelming, or unsafe in a way that makes direct engagement with reality feel costly or destabilizing, we often call this some result of that experience trauma. For many of us in the program, myself included, trauma occurred in an early age, often repeatedly. Personally, I experienced very early sexual harm prior to developing language. The trauma was repeated throughout childhood, alongside many others, but it was this pre-verbal violation that trained my nervous system from a very early age that certain connections were just not safe. What that means in practice is that my nervous system literally never got the chance to learn the mechanisms that create safe connection. So later on in life, when something neutral or even positive began to happen, my body would instantly read it as dangerous or threatening. That sort of pattern creates a very specific kind of problem because the need for connection doesn't go away when it becomes paired with the sense of threat. It just creates a contradiction that neither the mind or body can solve. So, since the system does not stop needing connection or meaning, it adapts how it meets those needs. One of the ways it adapts is by leaning more heavily on fantasy, not just as a tool for exploration, but as a way of stabilizing experience. It generates unreliable data in order to produce its own interpretation of reality. And once that interpretation is in place, it becomes almost impossible to take in anything that contradicts it. When I'm caught in that process, my mind generates conclusions earlier and earlier, often before there's any information to support them, because it reduces uncertainty very quickly. And at that point, I'm not discovering reality anymore. I'm just protecting the version of it that I've already created. And addiction is a fierce protector once it's gotten a foothold. This is where fantasy addiction starts to take on a particularly dangerous role for those of us who are anorexics and SLAA, when it's no longer helping us engage with reality, but instead providing a sense of control by limiting our exposure to it. And that can look very different on the surface depending on the direction it takes. Sometimes it looks like idealizing, imagining something unfolding perfectly, or it can look like catastrophizing, assuming something is going to go wrong, deciding that we have already failed. But those are not two separate processes. They're the same action moving in different directions to achieve the same purpose, building out a future that feels fixed and coherent. It's probably worth grounding all this in what actually brought me into the program. I came into recovery last fall on the heels of an incredibly unexpected separation, which has since evolved into a very contentious divorce. Looking back through the lens of recovery, it is remarkable to see how deeply fantasy addiction had seeped into every corner of my life, which at that point completely orbited my marriage and the fantasy of it being a happy one, oriented toward the future and starting a family. That entire fantasy dissolved when my spouse left without warning, leaving me disabled, medically vulnerable, financially abandoned, and stuck in an ongoing repetition of my own childhood trauma around poverty and chronic illness. It was one thing in that moment to discover that I was a sex and love addict. It was another thing altogether to then try and understand how I was also a fantasy addict and anorexic, and the ways those two aspects of my addiction had already been intersecting throughout my life. But this intersection has felt so compelling for me to understand in recovery that it's part of why I volunteered to give this talk, knowing I would be neck deep in legal preparation for my divorce case with a critical hearing just days before. To my credit, when I volunteered, I was also just waking up half asleep, and I now have a new bottom line that my phone stays on Do Not Disturb until after I've gotten out of bed and taken all my medications. But all that's to say, when the weight of this talk first hit me, I spiraled a little bit. I even arranged for someone else to speak this week. Because before I could realize what was happening, my traumatized, fantasy-addicted brain latched onto a negative fantasy version of myself. One who had nothing to contribute to this fellowship, simply because they were going through a hard time. That pattern showed up again, loudly and reliably, when shit really started to hit the fan last week. I found out my lawyers, who I fought for months to obtain after spending 6 months representing myself, were withdrawing from the case with 6 days left before the hearing. One of the first things I did in response was start drafting a message to the service team here, saying that I couldn't do this, that there was no way I could come up with anything relevant to say for people in this program dealing with this edge of fantasy addiction. What's really important about that moment is not just that I had the thought, but how convincing it felt. It didn't feel like a reaction or a feeling. It felt like a fact. There wasn't any part of me questioning it. That was reality, that I had nothing to offer, that I didn't belong here, that I was fundamentally out of place. I was further tested when the hearing came on Thursday, and I lost the legal battle I've been fighting tooth and nail over on every single front. So with everything spiraling out of my control, my addict brain did what it is now wired to do: take control wherever possible by limiting exposure to the outside world. Reduce input, reduce visibility, become smaller, don't take up space. In other words, disappear. It's a common tactic once the cycle starts, and that move doesn't feel dramatic. If anything, it feels like I'm preventing harm. It feels responsible. It even feels like doing anything other than disappearing would be irresponsible. The days since then have been a struggle to resist getting pulled into that cycle of shame that's become so familiar by now, because it really doesn't take much to start it. And once that frame locks in, everything else reorganizes around it. That's the part that's easy to miss. Fantasy doesn't just generate a thought, it generates an alternative reality that feels complete, indistinguishable from, and even preferable to the truth. From that perspective, it becomes easier to see the anorexic fantasy cycle for what it is: a form of self-erasure that creates artificial certainty. Because if I remove myself from the equation entirely, then I no longer have to face the uncertainty of whether I belong or am even wanted within it. Even before addiction or anorexia enter the picture, trauma distorts the mechanism of fantasy as a necessary human survival tool by priming the system to deploy it excessively to maintain an illusion of control. This is the cycle that can catalyze anorexic tendencies, where fantasy not only stops serving its original purpose, but actually becomes weaponized against the self. The fantasy then becomes a recursive, logical loop. I'm fundamentally bad, so I deserve isolation. If I don't deserve connection, it must be because I'm fundamentally harmful to others. What makes that loop so powerful is how quickly it closes. There's no space for curiosity. It just becomes self-sealing. Every new piece of information is filtered through that same lens, reinforcing a conclusion that was already reached. And because it feels internally consistent, it becomes very difficult to recognize this distortion. For me, this becomes painfully visible in real moments of connection. When something meaningful begins to happen, my mind moves very quickly to construct an interpretation. It decides what the interaction meant, what the other person felt, and what is most likely to happen next. As connections deepen and demand more vulnerability, the internalized voices of shame, fear, negativity, and self-loathing become louder and louder. My nervous system starts to read meaningful exchanges as fundamentally dangerous rather than potentially fulfilling. My rationalizing mind begins to build a catalog of reasons why connection is undeserved, algorithmically sorting for worst-case scenarios. Before recovery, truly no part of me could trust anything outside of the narrative I had already constructed, one built on inwardly directed cruelty in service of a single outcome: isolation. That's where the concept of anorexia, as it is used in this program, really began to make sense to me. It is a pattern of not taking things in, of being in the presence of something nourishing or meaningful and not allowing it to enter, not allowing it to change us. In the body, when this shows up as food restriction, the act of not eating can produce a sense of control, even a kind of physical high. But the critical piece is not the food itself. It's the learning that takes place. The system learns that deprivation feels safer than nourishment. It learns this because, over time, the brain adapts. Where it once rewarded nourishment, it begins to reward deprivation. The absence of input becomes the preferred state, because it is positively reinforced by the very same reward system that's been hijacked by addiction. That's the critical link for me, because it shows that anorexia is not a natural state or flaw. It's something that the system comes to prefer regardless of the cost. When I began to understand this, I also began to see that fantasy and anorexia were not separate issues for me, but interconnected strategies serving the same purpose. Severance from connection based on the belief that it is fundamentally undeserved. What makes this pattern so difficult to change is that it really works in the short term. It does create a sense of control. It moves the system out of vulnerability into something more defined and therefore something that feels safer. But it also blocks the possibility of receiving new information that could update reality and build resilience. It blocks the possibility that something might unfold differently than expected. And part of how it does that is by closing the loop as quickly as possible. It generates a conclusion, what something means, what's going to happen next, and then treats that conclusion as settled. Because the addiction doesn't need the story to be true. It just needs it to feel complete. And once it feels complete, there's no longer any reason to stay open to new information. In other words, it removes the very space where anything new could happen. That space is uncomfortable, but it is also where change becomes possible. It is where some of the deepest recovery happens, particularly for those of us who struggle with anorexia. Because it's only when I let myself sit in that space that I can use it as a sort of wedge to disrupt the negative reinforcement cycle of trauma and fantasy addiction, rather than let myself be consumed by it. Recovery and the program have given me so many tools to interrupt the loop, it's hard to name them all. Sponsoring others has been one of the clearest ways I've had to step out of that closed loop. When I'm working with someone else, I can't disappear into my own internal narrative in the same way. Top lines are not just important in staying sober, they're key tools in learning about what our wants and needs are in a way that we haven't been allowed to outside of recovery. Service keeps me in the room in a way that my anorexic instincts would never choose. It creates a kind of accountability to being visible, to being present, even when every part of me wants to withdraw. Prayer has also been critical. The Serenity Prayer, the Third Step Prayer, and Seventh Step Prayers are all part of my daily routine. Outreach, while ultimately fulfilling, has been one of the more difficult practices for me because it sits right at that intersection. It requires vulnerability and connection, but without letting my mind run ahead and construct meaning that isn't actually there. Step work is absolutely critical. Steps 8 and 9 have been key to this process for me and have required a complete reworking of my internal logic. For many of us with anorexia, that often begins with becoming willing to make amends to ourselves. If my default belief is that I'm fundamentally undeserving, then even the idea of making amends becomes distorted. Because to make amends, I have to believe that repair is possible. I have to believe that I'm not beyond forgiveness. More importantly, I have to let go of the idea that I'm broken beyond repair. When I was a kid, my dad was driving me to school one day, and he almost hit a butterfly. I was maybe 10 or so and yelled at him, "Dad, you almost hit that butterfly." And he quipped back with something that broke my brain. And he said, "Would you rather I have almost hit it or almost missed it?" When I didn't understand, he put it another way. Would you rather almost drown or almost be saved? For me, recovery has not been about eliminating fantasy or eliminating need. Neither of those is realistic or even desirable. It has been about recognizing when my system tries to resolve uncertainty too quickly or reduce input too much, and gradually building the capacity to remain in that space where something is real, something matters, and the outcome is still unknown. Life has held me in a particularly stark form of that for the past several months. At times, even within the past few days, reality has felt almost unbearable. Almost. But with the help of program and fellowship, faith in my higher power, it is becoming self-evident that as long as I'm still here, still choosing to stay and to stay sober, however difficult it is, then I'm not drowning.
Thank you so much for being here with us to share your experiences. So, question and answer time 20 minutes. So our team will now relay your questions from the floor that have been posted to our Zoom chat. Hopefully, I can't see any questions, so hopefully they've been posted somewhere. If we do not have time for our speaker to answer them all, please stay after the meeting to continue the discussion informally. Note the workshop is still being recorded, so please keep your microphone muted and try not to use anyone else's name.
You know, it took me years actually to know that I was living in fantasy. I mean, how did somebody younger find that out so quickly? Um, because it's my fantasy sometimes is hard to distinguish, from reality. I guess I've heard of maladaptive daydreaming, you know. So it's funny, like years ago, my aunt screamed at me and told me I was in a fantasy world my whole life, and she didn't even live in the same state. It's like, how did she know this? But I still didn't. It didn't register. It's just actually, I'm in my late 70s. I'm going to be 79 this month, and yeah, I'm really late to the game. But I guess it's an addiction in itself, I think. I don't know quite sure. But anyways, that's it for me. Thank you for sharing.
So just to make sure I understand, the question is, how did I discover this at a young age, that I was a fantasy addict? I think it just took having a really rude awakening. At the time, it wasn't included in the share, but when my spouse left, I was dealing with some pretty significant medical issues. I have several chronic health issues. In my head, like, I thought we had exchanged vows and done the whole in sickness and health thing till death do us part. But I had a thyroid mass that imaging studies had indicated had like an 80% chance or higher of being cancerous. And she left before finding out if it was or wasn't. And I think that was like, whoa, okay. Something about what just happened is not in line with what I thought was true. And thankfully, I reached out to a friend who was in the program and like went on my first meeting either the same day or the next day, maybe. So it was kind of like perfect timing, or a perfect storm, I guess. Yeah. So I got just introduced to it, exposed to the idea of fantasy addiction at just the right time where like everything was sort of coming to a head, if that makes sense.
How do you handle painful feelings in the moment?
Mm, not well all the time, to be perfectly honest. Um, Also, something that didn't get into the shares, I'm autistic, so painful feelings can be particularly dysregulating. And I'm learning how to let my body, I think, go through that, and when to take space from other people. So for me, sometimes that just like looks, like needing to walk around, like physically discharge, like whatever it is, let my body like make weird sounds and movements. That might not be true for people who are not neurodivergent. But there are other things like there's somatic things, just like putting on a song that feels good to move to. Anything that I think gets you out of your head and sort of into your body, is what first comes to mind for me. Yeah.
Lovely, thanks. Okay, the next one. Someone else, I'm just not saying names because it's to anonymize people. Someone else said, this was absolutely beautiful. Harper, you have a lot to offer, and this was very relatable. I would be interested in more about the connection between anorexia and fantasy, how fantasy prevents us from showing up for real connections.
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I've experienced it has mostly been in the form of like negative fantasy. And when I found myself, in particular, like in the fellowship where, outreach can be a little confusing sometimes, I found myself sort of disappearing or wanting to disappear from connections, because if I don't like hear back in a certain amount of time or like how the reaction that I expected, then my brain will just immediately start spinning those narratives of, oh man, like how I just totally crossed a line, or this person must think I'm terrible. So I should just like remove myself or erase myself, disappear. Um, and that not only like removes yourself from the equation, but it also then you're totally mentally preoccupied with being so worried about what you might have done wrong that it also removes the space for like I said in the talk for that unexpected thing to like to happen or to come true maybe, and it removes that other person's agency. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
Lovely. Thanks for your answer for that. And I'm just going to skip ahead to another one that related to anorexia. Somebody else said, did you work SLA anorexia steps? Did you feel the SLA steps were helping with fantasy? So that's a couple of questions there. And then also within this, what is your opinion on the actual difference between hypervigilance, which is a trauma response, and fantasy, as putting facts together that not necessarily are linked together is a form of fantasy. Really good share. Thank you. So a few different questions there. So, did you work SLA anorexia steps first?
I have not, but it's definitely something that I've wanted to do, and I'm looking for like right now my sponsor does not work the anorexia steps, so it's I want to work with a sponsor that specifically does. Um, but I plan to rework the steps as soon as it's just like a constant cycle for me.
I think it's a difficult one with that because no, not many. Well, it's usually co-sponsor thing where people sponsor each other, which is a really nice idea. So yeah, it's really hard to find any kind of SLA anorexia sponsor. Thank you for that one. And then, did you feel the SLA steps were helping with fantasy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so much is in the step work. Like that's what it's there for. Step four, yeah, that was probably the biggest sort of most dramatic reveal of like, oh, yeah, once you put it all down on paper, it's kind of hard to avoid what has been reality and what has been fantasy. Um, And I do think, again, like I said, steps 8 and 9 have been really helpful. Like becoming willing is important on its own. And then the whole process, like I've said to in other meetings before, like as I'm working my way through the steps this time, I'm really mainly focusing on the amends to myself, while knowing that there are other amends I will need to make, but this one is just so big, um, and so deep, and like it's like the kernel of my addiction that like it just has to be dealt with, I think, on its own first before I can even show up for other amends in the ways that I want to.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other question in this from this person from this fellow was, what is your opinion on what is the actual difference between hypervigilance, which is a trauma response, and fantasy, which is putting together facts that are not necessarily linked together? Yeah, I don't understand the end of the question, but yeah, there's a difference between hypervigilance, which is a trauma response, and fantasy.
That's a really, really good question. I think there might not be an overlap, but I think they're definitely linked very, very closely. What comes to mind immediately is that hypervigilance is more, as I experience it, like a sort of state of being where the nervous system is just primed to scan the environment constantly. Um, so that's the state, the abstract state in itself. Um, Fantasy is then what comes next of them maybe taking that data, and perhaps it's incomplete data, probably because that's just how the world works or how we take in things. And fantasy is what generates the missing data points to fill in the blanks and like create a new uh, version of reality rather than waiting to see what those data, like what that data would be if it came in on its own.
Really nice answer. Thank you. So next question, you mentioned something like I'm being a danger to anybody. These weren't your exact words, but would you mind going a little bit deeper into this as it resonates so deeply with me? Thank you so much for your share and your vulnerability.
Um,
Do you
yeah,
understand that one? You're unsure about that one?
yeah, I do. I'm just like that's a tough one, but yeah, because it's hard to answer without like just getting really personal about like my own histories, like being chronically ill, and having disabilities that like limit my ability to work and produce an income. So as it's showed up in relationships, particularly in my marriage and the relationship prior to it, like I've been a dependent spouse or partner, and um, have just been told in some ways that like I've ruined their lives. And I know now after like being in recovery that that's not true. Like everybody is responsible for their own side of the street. But that internalized narrative is very, very hard to, I don't think it'll ever necessarily go away, or it's just a matter of being able to like let it exist and not entertain it. Like, okay, I get it. You're there. You're loud. I'm gonna let this voice be louder. Um, yeah. I hope that made sense.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Um, so that's that one. So, somebody else said, I'm in fantasy 90% of the day. How do you sort through okay daydreaming and harmful fantasy?
Mm, a really good question. I think if it's bringing you closer to reality or like closer to, a solution to a problem or something, then it's okay daydreaming. If it's distancing you from reality or limiting your exposure to it, then it's harmful. Trying to think of a good example in my own life. Like I'm trying to figure out where the heck I'm gonna live next. So there's like a certain extent of daydreaming or like planning, trying to figure that out that is helpful. And then I think I also tend to get that cue from my nervous system once in this example, like that search tips into me feeling like more anxious about it, or like needing it to be a certain thing. As that sense of like that need for control increases, that's how I think I know, like, okay, this is starting to tip into addictive behavior, and I need to like just switch gears and leave this where it is, come back to it.
Thanks. So that's a nice answer, right? Someone, another fellow said, I missed the first few minutes, so you might have already covered this, but I feel like I heard you speak from a place of my system. I'm curious if you identify as a multiple. I don't know what that means. Hopefully that will mean something to you. And if so, how do you navigate working the program with multiple parts?
I think I understand that. I'm guessing that question refers to IFS, um, which I'm vaguely familiar with. So I can't say if I do or don't identify. I just don't know enough about it. I would probably guess yes, um, if I had to. But when I spoke about like my system, I was more speaking like my nervous system, if that makes sense. Like the literal central nervous system. Yeah. SLAA is my only fellowship currently, um, of all the others that I've heard of, and that's been the one that has been suggested to me the most, as another fellowship to look into. And yeah, well, I'm not also not currently in therapy due to cost reasons. That was another fellowship that that therapist sort of nudged me towards as well.
You said self-erasure was a solution, in brackets, negative. Um, what is the healthy alternative you found in recovery to avoid self-erasure?
It involves just letting yourself be really uncomfortable taking up space. um, and I should say myself be really uncomfortable taking up space. But like if I have an urge to delete a message, not giving into it, just like paying attention to it, acknowledging that it's there, and saying like, but no, if I did that, all it would be doing is erasing myself. Like so just leaving that trace evidence that no, I was here, I existed, I said the thing, and I'm gonna leave it there.
Another fellow says, I really resonated with the connection between fantasy as a way of creating certainty and stability. What are some strategies that you have developed to deal with uncertainty rather than relying on fantasy?
Concrete strategies. I feel like mostly it has for me it boils down to like really paying close attention to my nervous system, because there's just so much uncertainty in life, like it can't be eliminated. um, so instead of relying on fantasy, I'll give myself like more just kind of limited chunks to deal with a difficult thing, and recognize once I've hit my limit, like uh, again, like because maybe my nervous system is starting to get activated, or I'm starting to generate like too many solutions, and that gets overwhelming. That's usually when I can tell that I'm tipping into fantasy and need to dial it back.
Cool,
And so
thanks.
just different ways of, yeah, like staying regulated, breaking up my day. Top lines probably come in big time there, like moving my body around, walking the dog, embodied things like that.
How did you deal with your fantasy addiction at the most challenging times? Like when you mentioned about you lost a divorce case. How how did you manage your fantasy addiction at that time?
Well, that is still ongoing. um, at the time, I guess, I mean, so that was just really literally on Thursday, 3 days ago. Um, I just asked God, what's the next right step? And that's, yeah, I would say like typically, and probably how I would maybe even go back to answer the last question, is when I don't know, like, yeah, just asking God, what is the next right step? And not getting too hung up on, yeah, like I knew I couldn't control the outcome. So I just started taking what little steps I could. Like I had already sort of started to talk about without getting into specifics, but like had already started reaching out feelers for like rapid rehousing programs, and I just took the next step and did an intake with one of them, and yeah, just things like that, I guess.
So I think you mentioned that you find, even though fancy addiction has been obviously a huge challenge for you, some aspects of recovery from fantasy addiction you found really compelling. I think that's the word you used, or like I could just say interesting. I think,
Oh yeah, yeah, the intersection of fantasy addiction and anorexia. Yeah, that just kind of blew my mind that when I was experiencing these sort of negative thoughts that that wasn't just anorexia, but that was actually like a negative fantasy version of myself. Making that connection, yeah, was just really mind blowing. Or like uh, realizing that I am capable of doing things that the fantasy version of myself like says that I'm not. If that makes sense.
yeah, thanks. Could you speak a little bit about what your life looks like now as a person that's been in recovery for some time from fantasy addiction and from anorexia?
Yeah, well, right now it still looks just about as unpredictable as ever, but that feels okay. And I think that's the big difference. I cannot imagine what I would be doing or feeling, or I don't even know if I would still be here if it weren't for recovery, to be totally honest. Yeah, yeah, it's
Sure.
really been like a bedrock of sanity.